My name is Clay Williams, and this is People Talks, presented by Canal Pursuit Productions. The idea behind People Talks is that everyone has a story, and everyone's story has value. People Talks is a mixture of people with lived experience and people who work in health and fitness fields, one speaker each Sunday. Our speaker this week is Andrea Lines-Botell. Andrea is a life coach, mindfulness trainer, and meditation teacher. Andrea first started creating steps for solutions in conflict and crisis areas over 20 years ago while working as a corporate training manager in England. During this time, Andrea developed, designed, and ran training programs and motivational talks worldwide. Andrea currently owns and operates Mandalia House, offering support and creative outlets for all ages. Andrea, welcome to People Talks.
Thank you, Clay. It's a pleasure to be here and to meet up with you again. Thank you for asking.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to see you again. It's been a couple of years since we've seen each other.
I know.
Yeah, so why don't we start off with you telling us who you are and what you do?
Okay, well, you covered a lot of it in the introduction, so thank you for that very thorough analysis. So about 20 or so years ago, I was in England at the time and worked for a very large corporation and ended up in the training and development division. And that is where mindfulness first became something that was trained. And bearing in mind, it wasn't, mindfulness has been around for centuries and centuries and centuries. It's just reworded and regurgitated a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. But it's one of the first times in a corporate field that it was brought in about, being aware of your thoughts and how your thoughts feed into your body and how the energy you give off affects other people's energy. And from early on, just watching the impact that had on others, it became a passion of mine to be able to try and reach people in that way, mm-hmm. to see that they had the power, not their mind. Their mind didn't have the power over them, they had the power of the mind. And I've just been building on that ever since through different modalities and just finding different creative ways to reach people through mindfulness. So.
All right. 20 years ago. That's interesting. I only heard about, as you said, it's been around for centuries, right? I've mm-hmm. only heard the word mindfulness applied to it actually just shortly before I met you, a couple of years ago. Yeah, it was living in the moment. Was kind of a way to that I'd heard it described before, but yeah, interesting. And there's certainly a lot more talk about mindfulness and the power of mindfulness and the value, right? In the last little while.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I know if you look back at some of the books that are around and have been around for a long time. I'm thinking specifically of some of the Dan Millman books. I don't know if you've read any of those, Peaceful Warrior, and I'm just going to think The Power of Now and that sort of thing. I mean, they were sort of, I think I might have got the date slightly wrong, but I'm going to go with the late 1970s, I believe, into the 80s. So, but I was brought up in a very diverse family. So, my mother, for example, she taught me from a very young age about what you think you can manifest, right? Mm-hmm. So if I was starting to get sick or get unwell or feel a cold, well, if you think you're ill, you're gonna feel worse because in your mind's telling your body you're not well. So mm-hmm. about thinking through and actually presenting to your mind a place of wellness, which was fabulous at the time in some ways and absolutely not in other ways, because I kind of freaked out being a child, thinking every single thing I thought was going to come true. But then I was like, every time, when it's like one of those things where someone tells you not to look at something. Mm-hmm. You've seen it in movies about not staring at something on somebody and you can't help but staring. Yeah. So it was a very similar thing with the mindset, because as soon as I was told that, then I thought all these things I wouldn't normally think. and ended up getting myself into a bit of a loop on that. So it did take a little while to kind of get the real hang of that. And interesting enough, that did become one of the reasons why I love working with children, because I can, if part of working with youth and with children is if you can give them some really concrete steps for change that are tangible and not frightening, tangible in a positive way, then it allows for much easier transition. So when things that come in their pathway that might be challenging or overwhelming as they grow older in teen years and adult years, it's much more easily overcome. It isn't sort of as big as a crisis if they don't have the tools in place already. But yeah, so there's great ways of approaching mindfulness. And then there's this whole, I don't know if you've been hearing about people talking about toxic positivity recently. So there's this other downside, in a sense, if you can call it that, to mindfulness as well. And that's the pressure of so-called mindfulness and toxic positivity too.
Interesting. Well, it's an area that honestly I'm just starting to explore and learn about just in the past couple of years. So even some of the terminology is certainly new to me. So it's funny. I thinking back to quite a long time ago, and it was around the 1970s. I was golfing, so I was with a group of guys from my company and some of our customers. We had a regular group of 8 that golfed once a week, and it wasn't very competitive or anything. But of course, if you've ever golfed, you want to get better, right? So I wanted to get better, and that was the time of the method of self-improvement around that time was to buy a pack of cassette tapes on something and listen to the cassette tapes. Keep it simple, stupid. We had a lot of we had a lot of sales related stuff, the salesmanship stuff. But anyway, there was one on golf, and it had to do with visualizing the perfect stroke. Remember the last time you had a perfect shot, how that felt, and visualizing that over and over again, and generating some sort of muscle memory or the way that body feels, or your body feels when that happens. But also in that same package was a relaxation. It was like the bonus pack on the back, right? The bonus tape on the back of the pack, relaxation. And it was kind of a self-hypnosis, and wasn't at the time called mindfulness, but it absolutely was. You are here right now. What are all of your sensations telling you right now? What does your body, what do you smell? What do you see? What do you hear? And get all the other stuff out, all the other stuff that's causing you to not sleep very well or not do whatever very well. So yeah, it's interesting that this mindfulness thing that I thought was new is definitely not so new, right?
Did it help your golf swing? That's what I want to know. Was there an improvement in your golf playing?
It did, and something I learned from that, not just the power of visualization, not just for my golf swing, but for a lot of things going forward in my life. The visualization. I'm a left brain engineering guy, so this radical idea of being able to think something and get a result, that's just a little weird for me. You have to do something to get a result, not think something to get a result.
Right.
So when I first started applying this visualization and got results, it kind of flipped a switch. That's amazing, this visualization. So what else can I imagine in my life or in my performance or in anything? So visualization is quite a big part of my running.
Right.
Yeah, not in running fast or
Mhm.
or performance, but in I guess almost surviving mentally when I'm in late in a 100-mile race, for example. I always
Wow.
visualize the finish line. When my body tells me that I should be sitting down beside that stump and sleeping, I visualize the finish line because I know there's pain up until the finish line. When I cross the finish line, I know what it smells like. I know what it feels like. I know I'm going
Right.
to be exhausted and hungry and elated and all of the stuff, right? So
Right.
that it's yeah, it's kind of a um, not the same visualization as what a good golf swing feels like, but the same sort of tool, right?
And you're literally living it as if it's there and you're doing it, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
crossing the finish line. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I've used those techniques for all sorts of things, overcoming um, pain, for example, and
Mm-hmm.
it just, really using those tools. I have myself journeyed with PTSD in my past, and I know specifically coming through some of those trigger moments, using those visualization tools can really, really, really be effective for sure. And you've got to get, like you said, you really got to get down to the nitty gritty of like the taste, the smell,
Mm-hmm.
the textures, the tones, the colors. Like if you
Yeah.
can really work on that, because what you're doing so many different things in that moment. You're actually working so many different parts of the brain. You're also creating new cellular memory,
Mm-hmm.
which is amazing because the brain's learning that it can do something different than it's used to doing. Right. So in your instance, your brain is learning that it doesn't have to collapse and go and curl up under a tree. Right. It's
Mm-hmm.
learning that it can actually do something different and keep going. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and it goes back to what I said at the beginning about that we have the power and we forget that. We
Right.
often let our brain hijack us,
Mm-hmm.
right? And take over control. But
Mm-hmm.
I just had a memory actually as you were talking. Actually, when I was at school, I must have been maybe 10, that one of our teachers at the time used to get us all to meditate
Okay.
and
Wow.
take us on this like journey, and just imagine you're on a beach and imagine there's waves and imagine the sky. And now looking back, realizing how forward thinking that teacher was,
Mm-hmm.
because it
Mm-hmm.
just didn't happen,
Yeah.
right, for
Yeah.
most other
Wow.
people.
Hmm.
But and I'm really, really, really glad to see that more and more of the school systems are bringing in mindfulness, bringing in that awareness, and
Mm-hmm.
that's huge. There are massive steps forward still to take, of course, but we're so much further forward than we used to be. Like if
Mm-hmm.
you think about it, when we were younger, mental health just wasn't talked about.
No. No.
So, and I remember I had to, for some reason, I had to try and find out some information about our family history of mental well-being when I was helping my daughter through some mental health crisis. And when I was asking some of my other family members, they were going, well, maybe, but we didn't talk about it, right? So it could just be that relative was a little unusual, or that relative was really, really quiet, that no one discussed it like they do now.
Yeah.
And that's part of us becoming mentally well as a society and as a race, is being much more open
Mm-hmm.
and much more vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
that's part
Yeah.
of my
Absolutely.
journey with my own family, that vulnerability piece.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, remember, I spoke to my daughter before I came on this call with you, and just checked. I always like to check before I talk about things, if
Mm-hmm.
they're comfortable with me sharing.
Right.
And she's one of the biggest advocates of mental health. And I said, you can talk about whatever you want to with my
Mm-hmm.
journey. But I remember when she was in this mental health crisis point, which was beyond what any of us had the tools at the time, or thought we'd had the tools
Mm-hmm.
to cope with. And that involved the suicidal thoughts, the suicidal tendency, psychosis. Like it was a lot, because it was a family in crisis. It wasn't just my daughter in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so we ended up going down a path and going into sort of hospitalization and having that extra crisis care in place. But one of the pieces of feedback that my daughter gave at the time to me was, how did I know how to be vulnerable and own my mental health when you were always so strong?
Oh, wow.
And that's probably one of the biggest things that I say to parents. And when I'm working with clients, and I say to parents now, I actually run parent and youth mindfulness groups, and I get the parent and the child to both talk about their mental health. Because the biggest thing we can do for our children is to own our own mental health, not in a way of loading on weight and loading on pressure on the children to feel responsible for us, because that's not okay. No. But it's a matter of owning and saying, yeah, because there's way too many children who feel that they're the carers of families out there already. We don't need that to keep happening. But it's coming from a place of saying, I'm feeling anxious right now, and the things that I find help me with my anxiety are these, and talking more openly about, I'm feeling sad right now, and that's okay. Some of the things I do that help my sadness are this. What are some things you do? It's opening up that dialogue with youth, so they can go, wow, mom or dad or aunt or uncle, whoever, also feel sad or also feel anxious or also feel overwhelmed. And so it's okay that I do, right?
Right. Yeah. And there's
and
two pieces in that. Yeah. There's two pieces in that, right? One is one is the permission to or the realization that they're not alone, right? And the other is sharing some of the tools. It's not a dead end. It's not a dead end street. I've got some tools that have helped me work through. They may not be the same tools as you'll use, but you'll find tools, right? Yeah.
And I love that dialogue, when I open up that dialogue in my own life, but also with parents and youth, and just say, what is it that works for you, to the child or the teenager? What is it that works for you? So I might learn something that I haven't thought of. And this is what I use, and let's try that. And it opens up that sharing experience. But if all that children or youth see is unhealthy coping strategies or hidden coping, that gives them no benchmark of knowing what is okay and what is not okay. Right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Because mental health is, mental health is being human. We all have mental health that needs support at different times.
Yeah, for sure.
And even I always say, even Buddha or the Dalai Lama, right? They're not void of mental health challenges. They just work on it maybe a little bit more than some of the rest of us. So it's part of being human. Our brain is a fallible thing, right? So
So can you, are you okay to share some of your personal story? Your struggle. You had mentioned PTSD, and we have quite a few people listening, I think, who are struggling and curious to. I think there's value in understanding that there are other people who have similar stories, right, and have had some similar struggles, and some of the things maybe that you've done to help you overcome and survive and thrive.
Sure. Well, it's two-part, I guess. Sorry, it's two-part, I guess, in that conversation. For me, I think it's the realization of how impactful our childhood is on us. And, looking back and really taking ownership of where the line started, right? It's just looking at how did I get to this point without getting too deep and bogged down, but looking at the line, because when you can heal that line of your past, then it allows you to fully understand yourself in the now. And so it was only just sort of in the most recent years that I really looked at part of my life when I was in my late teens, and I actually went through a period of time where I couldn't leave the house. The thought of leaving the house put me into such extreme terror that I would physically halt and start shaking and sweating. And realizing at the time, because like I said, no one really talked about mental health, that there wasn't any counselors and there wasn't any guides and there wasn't any, acknowledgement. It was just, well, that's what it is. And you got pushed a bit more like, well, just get on with it kind of thing. Like you just have to get on with it. But that served a purpose because, sure enough, I did just get on with it, but that information goes somewhere in the body. Right? We just get very good at putting our barriers up. We get very good at putting the masks up. And so the mask goes up very, very strongly of I'm out on the world and I'm coping and I'm surviving and everything's good. But inside, I'm still the person hiding in the house, not wanting to come out. Right? So that doesn't just disappear. And so, there's a succession of different events in my life. I didn't really recognize it as PTSD particularly until I started working much more deeply in the work that I'm doing. And then, the more I was working on it, the more I was like, actually, I've had PTSD for years, but just saw it as me, as the way I function. Because like I said, I didn't come from an era where we talked about that sort of thing. And so learning about the triggers, learning about triggers and how to respond differently, how to reprogram my brain in a different way, and how to understand what needed to be healed for me to then be fully present in the now. So a lot of that for me came from, I tried all sorts of different healing modalities. You name it, I've probably tried it. So I went through very alternative healing to counseling, to EFT, EMDR, CBT, DBT. The only thing I didn't ever go to was sort of medication through the doctor's office. And I'm fully supportive that there is a need and a place for that for some people during some times. And I'm an advocate for that because a lot of parents come from a place of shame if their children need to be on medication. And I talk to them quite openly about that and saying, if it gives your child quality of life, because that's what it's about, let's give them back quality of life and then work on the tools. Because once the tools are stronger, then the medication may be able to be reduced or come away, right? But while someone's in that much pain of anxiety, depression, there's no quality of life left, right? So for me, it was like a series of learning and discovering what worked and what didn't work, which I really am glad that I did now because it's given me this expansive space. But one of the things that I found that worked the best for me is reprogramming my body to have a different cellular response. And so some of those tools for me, I remember specifically being in a supermarket and being so triggered that I actually have walked out of the supermarket and left the cart behind. And I'm sure there's people listening to this who've done the same thing. Because it's way too much information. There's too much noise going on. There's too many people. It could be what people are doing in there. If there's people who are being aggressive, for example. And so for me, some of my signs are shaking hands, sweating hands, heart palpitations, and then everything starts shutting down because you go into a flooding of chemicals in the brain, right? So what I've learned to do is to use breathing techniques. I cannot tell you the value enough of breathing techniques. If you have no other tool in your toolbox apart from breathing techniques, then you're kind of almost halfway there. Because the breath, as soon as we go into fight and flight mode, we start breathing from up here. As soon as we breathe up here, the brain thinks we're in fight and flight and it's ready to run or hide, right?
Mhm.
And so and as soon as we start to feel those triggers, directing the breath lower and deeper and slowing it. And then using a series of tapping techniques. And for me, there's all sorts of tapping you can do through EFT, which is fabulous. But we're in a supermarket, right? You're not going to start tapping everything going, right? And, try to check out. So, one of the things I work with clients on is the breath work, but also bringing in a different movement in the body other than being frozen, rather than being that frozen state. So, like I say to people, if you're for example, you have your cell phone with you and you're at the checkout, you can even just use your thumbs and tap and use affirmations and change your breath, because what you're doing is all you're trying to do is interrupt the signals in the brain. You're trying to interrupt what the brain thinks happens next. So part of that for me is learning to interrupt what the brain thinks is happening. And so it probably took me a lot longer to explain it than this talk. But probably my biggest thing I would say to people is the thing that we tend to do most, and even with my daughter, with her healing, for example, is we tend to not want to feel the pain. And as you know, because you know me a little bit from other talks we've done, I've helped a lot of people with addiction or who are grieving a loss, or who are in the dying process, right? And a lot of us don't want to feel the pain. And so we try and numb the pain, avoid the pain, or have a quick fix. And we're in that society of quick gratification, instant gratification. Like we have distractions at our fingertips, left, right, and center. We can just hit a button and be distracted from our pain. And so my biggest thing is, which I did expertly for years, is I expertly avoided my pain for years, which ended up manifesting itself into an even bigger issue. So part of it is like acknowledging the pain, because pain is magnified the minute we try and ignore it. And it goes somewhere in our body and it will come back up tenfold, right? It will, or we'll end up doing an unhealthy coping strategy, which leads to another whole thing we've got to then heal from. And so part of the thing that I've journeyed with my own healing is learning to be comfortable in my pain. So my daughter works with a lot of people with varying abilities, and she's absolutely brilliant at it and loves it. And one of the things she loves the most about it, there's many things she loves, but one of the things is that they're in the moment. Generally, they're very in the moment. And they're like, now I'm angry, now I'm happy, now I'm sad, now I'm funny, now I'm singing, now I'm crying, right? And that is we can learn a lot from that. We make things way too complicated. We really do. So if we can literally just say, now I'm feeling really now I'm in so much pain, right? Now I'm triggered, now I'm grieving, and that's okay. Change the breath, breathe it out. I am safe. I am right here, right now. I am safe. I am right here, right now. I'm safe. I'm right here. Because the minute you go, oh no, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, and you escalate it because you're freaking out that you're going to go through that pain wave again. But ultimately, we're prolonging it.
Yeah.
So it's learning to be comfortable in being uncomfortable, basically. It's like being comfortable in the uncomfortableness of being human.
Yeah, a friend of mine described his first anxiety attack, and he hadn't had one before. He was maybe late 20s, early 30s, worked in an office. It was a Friday afternoon. Things were pretty calm. Everyone was winding down for the day. He was sitting kind of I get the impression it was kind of in an open office with one other colleague. And he started feeling anxious. His heart started racing. And it was a foreign thing. There was nothing that came up that created that or started that. This anxiety started, and so why am I anxious? What am I anxious about? And that thinking about his condition made him more anxious.
Yeah.
And it he ended up calling an ambulance. He thought he was going to die. He was certain he was going to die that day.
Yeah.
Because his heart was just racing, and the tension of anxiety and that he hadn't felt before, and there wasn't a cause. There was not something. So it must be something inside me. It must be I must be dying.
Yeah.
Right. The body takes over.
It takes over, and it's hurt.
Mm-hmm.
It physically hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And it can lead to, as you know, it can lead to all sorts of actual physical illnesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
But having an anxiety attack or being triggered in PTSD or any of those hurt,
Mm-hmm.
like, because the body is having that response along with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made me think actually about some of how much, especially with COVID at the moment, how much the children are feeling those anxiety attacks, how much they're having panic attacks, how the heightened anxiety has increased. And that comes from a few different things. One is how they're witnessing the world responding to the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So how are their family responding to it? Do they feel safe? Because if their parents are overwhelmed or drinking a little more or panicking or tearful, then that's their benchmark. If my family are feeling this way about it, therefore I have something to worry about. Equally, the other piece of that is the difference in their social structures of what their norm is, right? Mm-hmm. So what I've noticed has become a thing, and maybe it's just because it's more obvious now because of social media, is how parents tend to do a sort of a form of gaslighting. And I'm using that term really loosely because gaslighting is a whole other conversation. But mm-hmm. when children are feeling anxious or upset or worried, the response might be that, no, you don't. You've got nothing to worry about. You don't feel that way. There's no need to feel anxious, or, you don't need to be worried. Mm-hmm. And that's completely dismissing the emotion, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas if the response is, I see you're struggling, or I see that you're feeling worried mm-hmm. about this, let's talk about this, because sometimes I'm worried too. Mm-hmm. Right? And going back to the beginning of the talk, having that honest dialogue rather than saying, don't be silly, you don't need to be worried, everything's going to be all right, blah, blah, blah. That's completely not validating or acknowledging what's going on for the child. Right. So the anxiety, and it is still there in their body, and they don't know how to process that anxiety. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because it hasn't been acknowledged, it hasn't been validated, and there's been no tools given of how to ride through that. But I know that with COVID, like, so many more people who say they haven't faced mental health struggles before are now facing them. And like you said, as your friend experienced, it's new to them. They don't understand what their body's doing mm-hmm. or how to support that. Right. And, really it comes from a sense of, we love, as a race, we love control. Right? It's part of our survival instinct to have control, mm-hmm. and our control's been taken away from us. And it's one of the first times in, I don't even know if it's the entire history, where the entire world's faced a very similar thing, right? If you think about it. Yeah, for sure. But our seeming control has been removed from us, and we are all free falling currently in life. Mm-hmm. No one really knows what anyone's doing, and all we know is we're being told all this information. There's so much mixed information, mm-hmm. and so our sense of control has been taken. And once our sense of control has been taken, our fight and flight survival mode is going to kick in, because we don't know how to survive anymore because our control's been taken. Mm-hmm. Right. But yeah. Everyone's baseline of stress is moved up a couple notches, right? And we're just a few steps closer to wherever the brink is for each of us, right? But yeah. Yeah, we all have our own different brink, right?
Yeah,
But,
for sure.
it comes down to, yeah, that we never had control. COVID or not, control was an illusion. It was just what we had was a standard baseline of what our life was.
Right.
And that standard baseline's been removed, right? So, but the control, the only thing that we have control over is our mind. That's it. We have no control over anything else. All we have is control of our thoughts. And it goes back to the beginning of the conversation, is we taking back that power. We have the power over our mind. And if we use that power wisely and from the place of healing and loving kindness, then anything that happens around us, we will adapt and grow from. It's just remembering that.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. And that will definitely take some work.
Yeah.
Old habits die hard, right?
It's something, and I work at it, as you know, because I've been doing this for a long time, and I often say that to people I work with. It's like, if you think about learning to tie your shoes, or riding a bike, or even first feeding yourself when you were a toddler, right? It wasn't easy. You'd miss your mouth, your peas would go in your ears, right? Your legs would end up falling apart, you'd fall off your bike. But ultimately, it became second nature. Ultimately, you can now do up your shoes, you can feed yourself, and you're not falling off your bike, right? And that's the same as mindfulness and mastering your mind and mastering your thoughts. It takes time and focus, but ultimately, if you do it, it becomes second nature, so you don't have to think about it anymore. It just is what it is. It just is the way you operate and function. And for me, it's just as important as what the food you put into your body, you know, what you're drinking, your exercise, your relationships with other people. All of those things we put emphasis on, our bank accounts, for example, we put our emphasis on all these other things, yet we tend to veer away from working on our mindset because it's harder work. But in essence, it's your most massive sort of rate of return, right? It's your most solid. It's your most solid investment. Like if you're in the stock market, it's a sure bet. You can't lose by investing in your mindset. You just can't. So
interesting. You mentioned money. I was listening to a piece on CBC Radio yesterday, and the guiding topic for the interview was the trial of the policeman in Minneapolis in the death of George Floyd, and the discussion led to the defund police movement and what are the alternatives to increasing the number of police in order to stop community violence. And one of them was that studies have shown financial stress leads to an increase in violence.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of the stressor things, and one of the things we can't control very well. We can control temporarily.
Yeah, financial stress, especially, and now, like, so many of us are facing that in COVID that we haven't faced before. And some people, it's their daily life, irrespective of COVID, but financial stress is huge because it threatens our safety. It threatens our security. Like if we can't pay the bills or buy food or anything, then we are not safe. And so anything that threatens our safety brings out those behaviors in us that are harder. And, and I think that's where there's a point of compassion and loving kindness with each other to really recognize what it is for somebody else. When we see someone else behaving in a certain way, or even if they seem to be okay, is just having that loving compassion of what their world is, what their stresses are, and what's threatening their safety.
Yeah, for sure. As you were talking, something occurred to me, and I have to ask you, and you don't have to answer, or I'm sure it's something you've thought about, but do you think your early trauma has shaped your career choice?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've often thought about that. Just looking at my journey with my own self, and then the journey I've been through with loved ones, and my children particularly, because there's been some sort of mental health crisis within that realm as well.
Right.
And I would say 100%, it's shaped where I've ended up today. Perhaps, and I think some of us do this anyway. I think some of us in the early point of healing try and make it mean something. I have to make my pain mean something or be worth something. Otherwise, what was it for? It was just pain, right? And so many of us go about that in very different ways, right? We find different ways of making it mean something. So the biggest downside to that is if you're doing it to try and fix everybody else, then that doesn't work. Because, you know, our job is not about fixing other people. Well, the way I look at it from my perspective is to be of support for those who feel that they can find something within my story or my experience that is of support to them. And just to be that safe space for other people. But I don't think, and I was actually talking to my oldest son about this the other day, and he said a similar thing, like if he hadn't have been through some of the things he'd been through in his life, there's no way he'd be the compassionate person that he is doing the things that he's doing now in life to try and promote betterment and support for humanity. And it's the same for me. There's different choices I could have made along my path that would have led me to a very different destination than this one. But knowing that perhaps one person in any one moment or any one week may feel a little safer or a little more heard because I've been able to be an ear for them, then it's been worth it.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, since I started the first Canal Pursuit run a few years ago, I've been calling myself a mental health advocate, but I'm not a counselor and I'm not a therapist. And when people first started asking me, or when talking to me about their stories, I would hand them a postcard as I'm on the way down the road and say, hey, I'm running to Ottawa for mental health. And a lot of people shared this story, and I was kind of alarmed at first, thinking that they're looking for help. They're looking for someone to help them fix something, and because I fix things, right?
But
no, it didn't take long to learn that there's value in just sharing time with people, right? Listening to their story, and even just helping them carry a burden for, even if it's just a little while, some signal that that there's hope and someone's trying to help. And some really rewarding, short, tearful, amazing conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're in those darker spaces, just being witnessed, being seen, being heard, being witnessed,
right,
is huge, because it can feel so lonely. It can feel so lonely, and to provide that safe space is such an honor, right? And so I've been asked, and other people said, would you choose, if you had the choice, would you choose the same path? And someone said, you could go through all of that to end up where you are now, or not go through all of that and end up being somewhere different. What would you do? And I would say, absolutely, it's worth it in the long run, because it's led me to meet some amazing people. It's led me to experience life in a much more full way than I knew how to otherwise, because as soon as you can really understand yourself and stand from a place of true ownership of who you are and understanding yourself on such a deep level, it allows you to just let go so much more and be present, not just for yourself, but for everything around you and everyone around you.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that's a gift. It's worth the hard work I did, right? And I just hope that I can allow that space for others who may wish to hear some of the things that have worked,
Mm-hmm.
or the beacon, just as you do, through the amazing work you do. Like, the more of us that can go be out there, like you and I and the other amazing people you've been talking to, the more of us who can stand and be vulnerable and own our story, the less alone other people feel.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
ultimately, that's part of the journey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have a list of questions. I'll get started on them now.
Okay.
So we've talked about quite a few of the things already that that I was going to ask you about, and we're about 50 minutes, so we're getting close to the end of the talk. A couple of things. Have you ever had a formal diagnosis of PTSD or a mood disorder?
No.
No,
No,
okay.
I haven't. That was something that anxiety was something that I did get diagnosed with.
Okay.
Actually, yes, that is a point. Yes, I did get diagnosed with anxiety.
Yep.
And that was actually off the back of losing a baby just after my first son. And so I went into a sort of a depression where the anxiety became more present.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the first time I really acknowledged that part of who I was. And that's kind of was part of my journey of realizing that I actually had anxiety from a young age, which then led to the realization of all these other things. So through talking to different counselors under their various umbrellas, it has been acknowledged that yes, I do have had PTSD, and I'm more or less out of it now.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't sort of through going to a doctor's office, it was through working with therapists and counselors.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, one of the questions I've asked a couple of the speakers so far is, and I know the answer for my wife who struggles with depression, but the time frame between understanding that there's a problem or something that's not right, or something that's that people aren't going to talk about and you have to hide. The time frame between discovering you have a problem and getting a formal diagnosis. And for some people, especially
Yes.
people my age, that's often quite a long time.
It is harder, I know. Like, I'll go back to my daughter for a moment, because I guess it took, my daughter was in and out of seeing different counselors most of her childhood, and then actually had assessments done. And it wasn't until, I guess, 3 years ago, so probably, you know, around the age of sort of 16, was actually correctly diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a journey. And if it had been caught much sooner, it wouldn't have led to where it led with her.
Right.
And it took going into a psychiatric hospital and a psychiatrist actually listening to her in a different way. Mm-hmm. To go, right, so I think the missing piece of the puzzle for you is this. Mm-hmm. And that missing piece of the puzzle led to like a train wreck of very difficult and challenging crisis situations. Whereas, you know, because she was under 18, the care was it was fast, even though it seems like a very long time. But the wait list as under 18s, especially in Ontario, to get care through some of the government sort of support is not that long, whereas adults is huge. Yeah. To try and get seen as an adult through CMHA and that sort of thing, the wait list is massive, and mm-hmm. It's not as readily available, for sure. Yeah.
We talked about meds. That's one of the things that that isn't talked about as much as it could be. There's definitely a stigma around meds. A couple of the people I've spoken to
Absolutely.
are taking meds. A couple of them are not. And as you acknowledged earlier, it's one of those things that could be considered a tool or an intervention or something that helps. And each person is different, right? And each situation and time frame is different. So it may be a lead in or a longer lasting solution, right? I know for my wife,
definitely for.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say for my wife, it was quite a long time, maybe a couple of years of of trying different drugs, trying different combinations or quantities or variations to get something that helped her, right? There are definitely side effects. There are things that antidepressants do that are side effects. So they can be reduced.
And it is a very and it's very to get, like, you're right, to get the right ratios or the right one for the right person can take a while. And I know specifically just working with one of the psychiatrists with my daughter, she was very much like the positives have to outweigh the negatives of the medication.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, and the goal is to be on the least amount for the most effect. But for the difference it can make in someone's life, the quality of life that can come back through the right form of support is worth it. Like and for those people I think who judge medication, perhaps may or may not have journeyed with mental health to the extreme that some people do, where it literally takes your quality away. Everything is just too difficult, too hard, too painful. And so if the right balance of medication is in place to give that quality of life back, like I said, then the tools can be worked on. And once the tools are then in place, then a different balance can maybe be brought into the mix, right? So, and I think that's one of the things I'd say, just that shame piece over medication shows us where we're at as humanity. Is say that I take medication, therefore I am weak. That's not right. That's, it's not, it's our mind just require more support other times. And sometimes there's nothing else out there that will do the support to give you the quality of life. And it's better that than feeling suicidal, or it's better that than going to some of the other addictions you could be going to, like self-harming, right? Or drinking or other recreational drugs.
Yeah, for sure. Last question, and you can deflect this one if you like. And it's only an opinion question. There might be study on this, and I'm sure there's study on this. I haven't read it, but what's your opinion about whether or not mental health issues are hereditary?
Interesting. Part of, and I'm not deflecting entirely. I'm just gonna go down a different line with it.
Yeah, that's all right.
I believe, and obviously haven't researched it, but I believe hereditary, yes, it plays a piece. What I absolutely believe is that from the minute we're conceived in utero is the minute some of these behaviors become ingrained, because we are still sensing, we are hearing, we are feeling. If the mother is anxious, or the mother has depression, or the mother is sad, or the mother's in trauma, then that is the environment in which the baby is growing. But also the minute that we are born is the minute where sponges just soaking up that information.
Right.
And so we are learning from a very sort of like sort of like clear space. So we arrive in semi sort of clear space, bearing in mind we've been through this sort of being held in utero with all information going on, but then we're birthed with all that information going on around us. So depending on how we're being looked after in that space will depend on how we process information.
Right.
And so, you know, you'll see those kind of trends waving and flowing through the generations of how we respond to different things. And I know when my oldest was young, it was a phase of natural parenting where you deflect. If they're going to experience pain or discomfort or upset, you deflect their attention away from it. You take their attention away from it. So then, but then the downside to that is they don't have the tools to know how to handle being disappointed or upset, because you've always deflected, right? You've always, and now there is a swing into allowing children to have lots of choices, to allow them to have choices, because we were brought up as children not being given any choices. We were just told, more or less, most of us, not all of us, but most of us were told what to do and how to do it, and really, but so there's been a swing to giving children loads of choices so they just feel, they don't feel safe, because everything's an option, right? And then if they, so, and then when the choices, they're in an environment where they don't have choices, they don't know how to respond. So, and then you've got the whole social media platform now where, again, it's instant gratification. You have in this society, not all of the world obviously, but in this society, you will often see parents giving their toddlers iPads or phones to keep them entertained while they eat in a restaurant, for example. And so the children are learning, like from very young, instant gratification. And so what happens when they can't have the instant gratification? They don't know how to respond. They don't know how to process information. So you know, I think it's definitely, a lot of it is learnt. Some of it, I believe, is in the genes, but some of it is societal, especially right now. That's why depression and addiction is so high currently, because there's just we just don't have a way. We lose ourselves in what is normal. We lose ourselves in being lost in worlds that are not our own. And so they were left with not having tools of how to actually come back to our own sense of reality, or feel empty by our own world and void. And so therefore then it comes down to, then it enhances any sort of depression prone thought. So I know that's a really broad, not answering your question, but kind of giving you some thoughts on it a little bit. But
yeah, nature versus nurture, not versus, but nature and nurture, right?
Yeah.
I think that's about all we have time for. Let's see. I've got nothing very clever to say. Did you want to close with anything? I was going to do a little commercial about our next speaker, but did you have anything that I haven't asked you about, or something that specific you wanted to make sure we covered?
I don't know, we managed to talk about a lot of different things, which is great, that it wasn't just put into one box, right, of conversation. I guess just the only thing for me is that for anyone who's watching and listening, we all, like I said, we all journey with mental health, mental well-being. And probably one of the biggest things that I like to kind of talk about is the guilt and shame piece. And we touched on it a little bit around medication and a few other things, is to start to, if you can, to come from a place of forgiveness of self, right? Forgiveness and compassion, and just an ownership, and just recognize that we are all human, and we are messy, and we're complex, and we're difficult, and we're challenging. And I think taking that pressure off ourselves of thinking that we should be other than, or better than, or perfect, or always one thing, taking that pressure off and just going, you know, we're messy. We are messy and we are complex and we all struggle, and it is okay. And do not run from the uncomfortableness of life. Use it as your superpower. Use yourself as your own superpower, your own superhero, and just know that you have the tools to ride through it. As soon as you take that guilt and shame piece away from you, it's amazing how much stronger you feel.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no guilt and there's no shame in having mental health challenges or mental health that needs support. There's no shame or guilt in that.
Mm-hmm.
It just means you're human and you're one of all of us.
Yeah, for sure. That's a powerful message. That's a really powerful message, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Andrea. I got the pronunciation of your first name proper.
Yes.
I really appreciate the time that you set aside and spent with us.